It's somewhat a good time for me to move to this new job at the University of Western Sydney, because this year is, for me personally, 50 years ago my family moved to Western Sydney, to a lovely little suburb by the river called Panania, which is about 25-30 kilometres southwest of the Sydney CBD. And on the occasion of our having discovered that it was 50 years ago, we had a bit of a family get-together. And somebody brought along this wonderful photo taken from the air of Panania around about 1953-54. And it's remarkable because what this photograph captures is what Sydney was actually like as it rolled out its suburbs in the post-World War II era. This was the time of the baby boom. All of those new families that were delayed in formation because of the World War. Suddenly, here were young marriages, optimistic young people in a new continent, in a new nation, moving to the suburbs. Now, what was provided for them? What can we see from this aerial photograph? We saw, firstly and very clearly, the railway line and a brand new railway platform. Locals will know that that railway line went to the city. Why did it go to the city? Because that's where the jobs were. So the first thing you had in mind to when you built a new suburb in the 1950s in Western Sydney was that you had to provide a way for people to get to work. And the answer in the mind of the planners and government officials who made that decision was people should travel to work on the train. And it's amazing how much we have shifted from that very simple, generous notion that civil society should provide to its people a way to get to work that is cheap, efficient and collective. And in that 50 years period, 50 years since, we now have said that the way you travel to work is an individual decision made by you in a car on your own, paying for that expense. It's changed substantially, and perhaps unconsciously, perhaps we've just seen it slip away, such that in Sydney now only 25% of people travel to work by public transport, 75% travel by car. The other thing you can see from this photograph is the collection of these things we call Housing Commission rental offices. So the assumption wasn't that you would be able to move to the suburb and build your huge 40, 50 squares of premise. In Sydney we call them McMansions now. Buildings that cover an entire block with 4 or 5 bedrooms, rumpus rooms, home theatrettes and all sorts of things. In the 1950s the houses were modest, but they were provided by the state. They were public housing. And it was normal for people to live in public housing. They had the opportunity to buy that house and convert it to freehold title as the family earned a bit of income and we were able to get some equity, some ownership of their property. So the rollout of the new suburb had at its core 2 things: public transport and affordable housing. And we've shifted a long way away from that now. There's a new funny term in Sydney for commuters. They're called squinters. So Sydney lies across the east coast. The sprawling suburbs are to the west, into Western Sydney. Each morning the sun comes up, the commuters hop in their car, they drive into the rising sun, they squint. They go to work, at the end of their day they hop in their car, they turn the car west back to the new suburbs. Of course the sun is setting straight into the rise, they're squinting again. So it's pretty funny, we've built a city of squinters. The trouble is that we've built a city that's heavy in its use of energy. These sprawling suburbs are not sustainable. We are unable to say to the people of the South Pacific that you have to deal with your own problems of sea level change while we continue to drive our cars eastward in the morning and squinting back into the sun in the west so we can get to our big double-storey McMansion houses on the periphery of the Sydney. Those decisions have consequences. Now, obviously there's a lot of issues involved here. The question we have to ask as residents of Sydney, and indeed residents of most Western cities throughout the world, the sprawling 20th century city is really has to confront itself and ask, what can we do to make sure that the 21st century ends with an urban world that is sustainable? Because now more than half of the world's people live in cities, and that proportion is going to grow. In China, for instance, it will add 400 million people to its urban population over the next 20 years. We can't expect Beijing and Shanghai residents to look after their sustainability issues while we don't look after our sustainability issues in the Western Sydney, in Western Sydney, in Western cities. In Western cities, we have to provide exemplars of the way to run sustainable cities, so we can point to places like Beijing and say, look, do not build cities like we have built them. We are changing the way we are running our cities, and we can set an example for you and show you how we can actually build sustainable, quality living cities. So what does that mean? Firstly, there's no question there's individual responsibilities here. We have to make decisions about where we locate our house of residence. We have to use public transport. We have to watch our packaging in the products we buy. We have to watch our energy use. We have to watch our water use. We have to watch our use of the motor car. All of those are important individual decisions. On their own, they won't solve the problem, because in the end, your job is basically where somebody locates the employment of the city. Your ability to use public transport depends upon somebody providing it properly, efficiently, and in the places where you want to start from and where you want to go to. Your schools, your shopping, your recreational amenity has to be looked to. Every day in Sydney, there are 16 million journeys undertaken. Obviously, journey to work is a big one, but it's no bigger than the journey to shop, the journey for social life, the journey to recreation, and the journey to school. All of those things are journeys. 92% of those journeys in Sydney are undertaken by the motor car. It's an extraordinary proportion, and it's simply unsustainable. In the main, however, people have no choice. People have a little bit of choice. They could walk some journeys, ride a push bike in other journeys. But by and large, things are too far apart. People use the car. The average amount of time that each Sydney resident, man, woman and child, spends journeying per day, and remember these are nearly all by car, is 78 minutes. That's nearly an hour and a half of everybody's time that's simply spent travelling around the city. The fact that most of that is in the car and involves the consumption of petroleum and the emission of carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide is simply unsustainable. The only solution is for civil authorities to do something about that. We need to re-engineer our city. And the lesson is that when we rolled out our suburbs in the post-war period, we could be single-minded about what communities should have: a public transport system and affordable housing. And in 50 years in Sydney, we seem to have forgotten that we can engineer our cities in sustainable, worthwhile ways. And now it's up to us to actually have a concerted program to say the way we are doing things in cities like Sydney aren't sustainable. The peoples of the South Pacific, whose very existence depends upon there being a stable ocean Pacific environment. It means that people in cities like Sydney have a great responsibility not just for their own quality of life, but for the quality of life of people in the South Pacific and in other parts of the world.